for being here. I'm very glad for being here. It's the first time I actually present this paper to a South African audience. So thanks for the invitation. Okay, so let me start with a short motivation of this paper, for this paper. So we know that in many developing countries, often we observe low political participation and low electoral competition. And these two factors are often identified as some of the drivers for poor governance. International observers and researchers have argued that new technologies such as mobile internet can provide new opportunities to solve these issues. So to encourage political participation and also to foster competition at ballots. And so these technologies can perhaps have an impact on some of the governance issues in the developing economies. However, very little is known about the impact of the internet on participation and electoral competition, and especially little is known about developing countries. On the other hand, a little bit of evidence exists on developed economies such as Germany, Italy, and the UK. However, this evidence usually finds negative effects of fast broadband internet on voters turnout. So in this paper, I'm trying to understand whether the arrival of a new infrastructure, so the 3G internet, can promote participation of voters at ballots. If it can foster competition. So, for instance, creating new, incentivizing new parties to run for elections, and eventually also affect the voting behavior of the citizens. So I decided to focus on South Africa mainly for two reasons. First, because the political scenario is quite interesting, right? With a a long, basically with a monopolistic party that has dominated the political scene since the end of the apartheid, and the current decreasing share of votes that is taking, so decreasing popularity. And on the other hand, South Africa is also interesting in terms of technology, because sorry, I hear some noise. I don't know what's. Thanks. I was saying it's interesting in terms of technology because of its quite developed infrastructure for mobile internet and also uptake by the population. So I'm going to focus on South Africa and particularly on local governments. So I'm looking at the municipal elections between 2000 and 2016. And the empirical strategy will exploit the gradual expansion of 3G coverage over space and time. And this allows me to do to carry out a difference in difference estimation. And finally, we'll provide some evidence, some suggestive evidence on the mechanism, on potential mechanisms that drive the results. And I will focus on two. One is information and the other one is coordination. To give you a preview of my findings, let me mention that I find that 3G internet caused voters turnout to increase by approximately 2 percentage points, while the ANC vote share dropped by almost 3 percentage points as a result of the internet. And the other parties' share went up. At the same time, electoral competition got more tight. So the number of parties running for elections went up by 10%. And I also, I do find some supporting evidence for the two potential channels that I mentioned. So 3G internet lowered information cost, and these helping people to find extra information that eventually punished the incumbent party. On the other hand, I also find evidence suggesting that 3G lower communication cost, and these eventually help potential candidates to coordinate and so to enter into politics and to form new parties. So this paper contributes to three main streams of the literature. The first one is the literature on participation in competition in developing countries, which I already mentioned. The other literature is on broadband internet and voting behavior and local policies. As I said, here the main findings for developed countries suggest a negative effect on turnout and also crowding out effects, in the sense that 3G, the arrival of internet decreased the usage of traditional media, such as TV. And Miner, the last paper that I cite, actually focus on Indonesia. So it's a developing country, and it finds positive results on turnout. So I'm contributing to this literature by providing new evidence on South Africa. And the last stream of work I try to contribute to is the one about the effect of infrastructure, of information infrastructure and technologies on political mobilization and political accountability. In this sense, I draw from Manacor and Tesei to help me conduct the analysis on the information versus communication mechanism at the end of the paper. Okay, the South African political scenario was dominated by the African National Congress, and is still currently dominated by it. However, the support for this party decreased in the last elections. So let me first mention that all the paper is about local governments, and so I will focus on municipalities. So there are more than 200 municipalities, local and metropolitan municipalities, whose councils are elected every five years. So in the table, you actually see the outcomes for the parties at the municipal elections between 2000 and 2016. So as I mentioned, the African National Congress gained, as you see, some votes from between 2000 and 2006. However, after 2006, it seems to start declining in terms of share. While the opposite is true for the Democratic Alliance, and also other new parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters, which was formed after in 2013, seem to have gained. At the same time, voter turnout, which was below 50% in 2000, increased and went up by almost 10 percentage points. And a similar increasing positive trend we see for number of parties running for elections, which more than tripled between 2000 and 2016. So to find some potential explanations of why the ANC party vote share dropped, we can think of the political and social turmoil that affected the party and the figure of the former President Zuma, especially after 2011. So, for instance, there has been events. There's been strikes at mining sites, and there's been a controversial use of the force by the police, who actually killed more than 30 people in one of these events at the Marikana platinum mine in 2012. And there has been other events of such type. And the people, especially Black people, felt betrayed by their party, who didn't take the necessary action to save those lives. At the same time, Other scandals have emerged within the party, within the incumbent party, and those are more related to corruption. So, for instance, the obscure relationship between President Obama and the Gupta family, as well as the more recently cover campaigns that were conducted by the ANC party to undermine and to target opposition parties such as the economic freedom fighters. So all of these events, they created discontent, and especially the people were blaming the incumbent party for, and therefore probably also due to these events, Zuma resigned in 2018. At the same time, the media landscape in South Africa is considered to be fragile. So citing the Reporters Without Borders, coverage of certain subjects involving the ruling of ANC, government finances, or state-funded improvements to President Zuma's personal home are either off limits or provoke a hostile reaction from the authorities. So these restrictions are likely to hold for traditional media, but maybe they're likely to apply to digital media and to online information, which is all promoted by the spread of the internet. And the internet, the mobile internet market is quite advanced in South Africa, with three main internet service providers, private internet service providers, who have more or less equal market shares. And thanks to investment in the infrastructure, internet usage went up from 5 to 50% between 2006 and 2016. So at the same time, of course, usage uptake have to be, as I mentioned, was accompanied by investments in infrastructure, right? So a widespread coverage over the territory in terms of 3G. I'm always talking about mobile internet. So here in the map, you see 3G coverage. So what you see here are so the districts that you see. I computed the share of area of land which was covered by 3G in different points in time. So here you see 2006, where the average coverage over the entire territory was about 10%. The coverage went up over time, so from 10% to 22% in 2011, and even more if we look at 2016, when average coverage was more than 50%, actually was 60%. So I'm going to exploit the variation in 3G coverage over time and space, so this one that you see, to understand whether there might be some link between the arrival of internet and those trends that we observe overall. The internet is also quite used to access information. So these are survey data from Afrobarometer about South Africa specifically. And the figure on the left shows the share of people who report to use each type of media to access information at least a few times in a month. So for instance, you see that about 90% of people, more or less, were used to access information through television or radio, while about 60–70% of people is used to access information through newspaper. So the circles on the bottom instead look at how many people use the internet to access information. So while traditional media usage was pretty stable over time, you see that between 2011 and 2015, the use of the internet to get informed increased dramatically, right? It went up in more than doubled. That is true for the whole population, but is also true only if we look at only the population for internet users only. So those people that tend to use internet more regularly. So these pictures tell us two things: that first of all, there seems to be no crowd out effects of internet usage on other media usage. And second, that the internet is used extensively also to look for information online. While if we look at administrative data on newspaper circulation, we see generally a negative trend, so a declining trend. So in this case, in both, so in the top picture shows national daily outlets, while the bottom picture shows local outlet circulations. So these are printed copies, sold printed copies. And you see that in both cases, the circles and the squares in the graph exhibit a negative trends, which means that over time, printed press circulation decreased. While on the right and on the right axis, I plot the number of unique browsers. This is yearly unique browsers, I guess. No, sorry, daily unique browsers in the last year. So for those years for which the data is available. And in this case, you see, of course, the opposite, right? You see an increasing trend. And it's actually quite steep. Okay, so the data that I'm going to use combine different sources. However, first of all, before talking about the different sources, I have to briefly mention what type of unit of observation I'm going to use. So as you probably know, the number of voting districts change over time. Why? Because the boundaries itself is going to change over time. So voting districts are the places where people go to vote, right? So the boundaries of these so these are geographical entities. However, they are defined by a specific board, and every year, more or less, they actually the board is going to redefine these districts. So this poses a threat to identification and to the analysis in general, because I cannot compare units that over time are going to change in terms of size and shape. So what I had to do, I had to create some stable units that allows me for comparability. So I take the spatial intersection of all voting districts between 2000 and 2016, and I create my units of observations. And these are stable over time, and also they are more exogenous in terms of how politicians can, for instance, strategically affect them. So once I have this grid, it's not like a square grid. I mean, it's just given by the spatial intersection of existing voting districts. So once I have these units, I attach data. So I start, attaching information to each of them. So the first information is political outcomes that comes, and the source is the Independent Electoral Commission. And then I have information on 3G coverage that comes from the GSMA. I will briefly tell you about this later. I have information on census data, on luminosity, which is a proxy for income, education, age distribution, population density, and ethnicity. And finally, I have geographic information on terrain characteristics or distance to cities or to the fiber backbone. Throughout the analysis, I'm going to exclude provincial capitals and larger cities, mainly for two reasons. First, because these cities might already have landline internet, so fixed line internet, which can somehow bias the results, or people that might be exposed to Wi-Fi connections. However, the results tend to be robust to the inclusion of these cities. Okay, this is an example of the 3G data that I have. So 3G data comes at a very high resolution. So for each pixel that you see, for instance, on the right, I have information on whether there is or there is not coverage, 3G coverage in a specific year. And these pixels tend to be quite small, varying from 1 by 1 to 200 by 200 meters between 2000 and 2016. For each of my defined observational unit, I compute the share of land which is covered by 3G internet in every year. Okay, so I just take the spatial mean, let's say, between across years. Okay, so I think it's useful to briefly mention what might be the determinants of coverage. And as I already mentioned, so the internet service providers are private firms, and as a result, they respond to economic incentives. So there will be both demand and supply factors that determine the internet availability in a specific geographic area. And these factors tend to be larger potential market size in terms of income and populations, which of course, places that are richer or that are highly densely populated, they might have higher access to the infrastructure, to coverage. However, on the other hand, places that, for instance, are higher or whose terrain characteristics are not that smooth, they tend to have worse coverage. This is something that is common to the technology, not only to South Africa. So I provide evidence that, in fact, those factors, even in South Africa, are still important determinants for 3G coverage. Now, this fact, so the fact that private firms respond to both demand and supply factors, it's also a challenge for the causal identification. And the reason is that there might be unobserved factors that tend to be correlated both with 3G internet coverage and with political outcomes. And if this happens, then the estimates are biased. So to tackle this issue, I'm going to use two different approaches. The baseline strategy is a difference in difference estimation. So here, what I do, so Y is the outcome of interest, and I is a particular subsection of a voting district, and T is years from 2006 to 2016. C is coverage, which is the share of area covered by 3G in each voting sub-district. And I'm going to basically to estimate a quite standard diff-in-diff equation by interacting the share of area covered by 3G with time dummies. So in this case, I have the 2011 and 2016 year dummies. Okay, so this first term represents my coefficients of interest, the interaction between coverage and year dummies. To address potential endogeneity issues, I also add a set of controls. So X is the vector of time variant controls, while W is a vector of time invariant controls measured at baseline in 2000, interacted uh, with ear dummies. I also include vote subdistrict fixed effects and time ear fixed effects to take into account for potential time invariant omitted variables that can influence both coverage and political outcomes, as well as to control for secular trends. Here, the identification assumption is the parallel trends. So it requires that the change in the outcome Y in more and less exposed or covered localities would have been the same in the absence of 3G. I will try to provide some evidence running some placebo estimates on the validity of this assumption. A complementary strategy exploits this geographical instrumental variable. So the rollout of 3G requires at least two actions. If possible, the service providers have to update existing 2G infrastructure, which is located at the base station of each antenna. If this is not possible, then the providers have to build new antennas, which means they have to connect them, laying down fiber optic cables that go back to the backbone network. So among other things, I find that, and also from technical reports, terrain characteristics matters, and specifically the ruggedness of the terrain is an important determinant. So I'm going to use ruggedness as an instrument for coverage. I'm not just using ruggedness alone, but I'm exploiting the fact that ruggedness became crucial for coverage only after 2005, which is the year in which, more or less worldwide, the 3G technology became available. So the first stage will try to predict coverage using ruggedness interacted with a post-dummy variable that takes the value 1 after 2005. And in the second stage, I'm using the predicted coverage to see how it affects the political outcomes. In this case, it's important that the instrument, so the interaction of ruggedness with the year 2005 is exogenous. And this requires that the correlation between ruggedness and omitted variables didn't change around 2005 other than through the availability of the internet. In the paper, I do some exercise to convince the readers that this is true. Okay, so let's go through the main results. So first of all, I'm going to show you the results from the difference in difference estimation, where turnout is the main outcome of interest. So we focus on columns 1 to 4. And as you see, I increasingly add new controls. So column 1 is the plain estimate, only with voting district and year fixed effects and province time trends. As you see, as soon as I add demographic controls, the estimates drop, but still remain positive and statistically significant. And most importantly, as I add geographic and polynomial controls, these estimates tend to be quite stable. So these numbers suggest that going from 0 to 100% of the area covered by 3G affect turnout by almost 2 percentage points. If we look at the 5 to 8 columns, which present the results for the ANC share, we see actually negative results, right? So here the results, the estimates indicate a negative impact of 3G coverage on vote share for the ANC, by approximately 3 percentage points. These results can be visualized in a couple of nice pictures. So here I'm plotting the voter turnout and ANC vote share for two distinct groups of voting districts. The continuous black line is the outcome for those areas whose 3G coverage in 2016 was above 50%. So those are covered, let's say, area, mostly covered area, while the dotted line report the outcomes for those areas which tend to be less covered by the internet. So as you see, covered area tend to have higher turnout after the internet comes, and the ANC vote share drop by almost 3 percentage points. These graphs are also useful to partially attenuate doubts about the potentially diverging pre-trends. In fact, these two outcomes are quite parallel before the internet kicks in. So IV results on these two outcomes seems to suggest to tell the same story. So if we just look at OLS regressions of turnout on coverage, we see positive results, positive impacts, around 1 percentage point. And as soon as I conduct the IV implementation, the estimates on column 3 and 4 suggest that the OLS seem to be actually a lower bound for the estimates, right? Or underreporting the true effect. In fact, the estimates jump to around 7 to 6 percentage points. And a similar story is true for the ANC share, where again, the 2SLS estimates tend to be much larger in magnitudes. So given the fact that the diff in diff, the parallel trend assumption holds and the estimates actually seems to be more conservative with respect to the IV, I'd rather focus on the diff in diff as the main strategy to study the effect of internet on political outcomes. So if we expand the diff in diff on additional outcomes, we see that the Democratic Alliance vote share increased by almost 3 percentage points, while nothing happened for other parties. And at the same time, if we look at the number of parties running for elections, we see an increase, which is about 10% of the mean in 2006. To provide additional evidence, I also focus on the number of protests against political institutions and political parties. And we see an increase in this protest. And this might signal that 3G is actually exacerbating political discontent. Okay, this is again parallel trend assumption for the number of political parties. And you see that areas that are most covered by 3G tend to have higher number of parties than the other localities. Okay, these results are robust to different specifications. And I also have some evidence providing validation for the parallel trend assumption empirically, and also validation for the exclusion restriction of the instrument. Okay, since I have more or less 10 minutes left, I'd rather talk about the potential mechanism. Okay, so here the question that I'm trying to answer is, what are the potential drivers of the observed relationship? And I draw from Manacor and Tesei, from the recent work on Africa, to investigate two possible channels. The first one is more about the demand side. So internet lower information costs for voters. And so more informed voters, they might change their behavior at ballots. The second channel is about the supply. So in this case, the internet can reduce the coordination cost and the communication cost for politicians, and so improve or foster political competition. In general, the method that I'm going to use is a triple difference approach, where I add an interaction term to the equation, which is made of the interaction between coverage with ear dummies and E. So in this case, the letter E measure how much a given locality is exposed to specific events that might represent how much the incumbent party can suffer from people denouncing poor governance or specific events like the miners' strikes. So let me be more specific on this. So to investigate the information channel, I focus on two sets of events. First is the quality of governance at the municipal level. So I use the information from audited financial statements at each municipality, and I take the regular expenditure per capita as a proxy for quality of governance. So in this case, since most of the local municipalities are run by ANC party, it's easy for people to blame the incumbent party if events of corruption or related to bad administration of money comes up. The second set of events I'm exploiting is the variation again across different localities in the value added from mining and quarrying as a proxy for the exposure to the people to the social and economic discontent that was following the miners' strikes. And of course, the brutal repression of the strikes by the police. So in both cases, the ANC party and President Zuma were considered accountable for the administration of these events. And therefore, the hypothesis that people that tend to be more exposed to these events, if they have an additional source of information and they use that information, then they're going to change even more their behavior at ballots. So we should expect an additional loss in the vote share to the ANC party. And in fact, that is what I find. So in places with high irregular expenditure, having the internet reduces the vote share to the ANC party of one additional 1 percentage point, column 1. The vote share so the votes that this party lost goes into other parties, which tend to be smaller parties. And at the same time, the new party formation seems to be fostered. And these effects tend to be larger in localities where traditional media penetration is lower, suggesting that there, in these places, so columns 1 and 2, that is where the internet is making a difference, perhaps informing people on the administration from the ANC. Similar results hold if we look at mining, and how coverage interacted with exposure to the mining strikes. So in places where the mining industry is relevant for the economy, we find an additional 3 percentage point loss in the ANC share in those places covered by the internet. And this loss was accompanied by an increase in the Democratic Alliance share. At the same time, there was political discontent that is basically signaled by a negative effect of coverage on voters' turnout. To provide additional evidence on how 3G affected people opinion towards the presidents, I used survey data, again from Afrobarometer. And here I'm plotting the evolution of opinions over time between individuals that are covered or not by 3G. So the black line, the black continuous line, is depicting the situation for people that have 3G. And those people are more likely to distrust the president, and the distrust in the president increased over time, and specifically after 2011. And a similar picture is a similar picture we find if we look at how at the percentage of people that think that the president is corrupt. By the way, the president here in this case is Zuma. Okay, I mean, it's the former president. And we see that having 3G makes people more likely to think that the president is indeed corrupt. Google searches on specific terms that are related to information or news consumption and corruption say similar things. So here I'm comparing Google searches for specific search terms such as news and corruption with a basket of other search terms that are not related. So for instance, beauty or personal trainer or food. So something that doesn't relate to news or corruption or to politics. And I find that with respect to the basket of words, the search term, the Google searches for news increased steadily over time. And if we look at searches for corruption, we see that they tend to jump recently, most recently, so after 2013, especially in periods of elections. So the vertical lines here represent election periods. So the internet seems to be used to search for these words related to politics. Okay, the last channel, so I have a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes, and then I'm done.
Take your time.
Thanks. The last channel I'm trying to investigate is the coordination. So the idea that 3G significantly reduced barriers to entry into politics. And it can do that both because it lowered communication costs between candidates and voters, and as a result, the political mobilization on the web becomes cheaper because it becomes cheaper to reach larger audiences for politicians. So this affects political competition through the new party formation or existing parties going to run in new places. So I define a new party as a party that didn't run in any district in 2000, and I'm looking at whether it's more likely for 3G to basically, so it's more likely in 3G covered areas to have new parties with respect to not covered areas. So the first 3 columns look at how 3G impacted on new party formation. And we see that there is a positive effect, and the estimates suggest more or less the magnitude is about 1. So covered areas tend to have 1 additional party running, new party running for elections. While if we look at the number of old parties, it seems that the opposite is holding. So it's less likely to see old parties running for elections. So this seems to actually suggest the idea that new information technologies can actually foster party turnover. And also the probability of a new party running seems to be to increase, especially if we look at the OLS and 2LS estimation. Generally, these effects on new party formations tend to be larger in those places that where the expected return to form a party are higher. And so they're higher, for instance, in places with higher turnout, or in places with high cell phone penetrations, or in places where a greater majority of the people is not voting for ANC. There might be additional potential channels which I don't investigate specifically, and these might be, for instance, new monitoring technologies at the voting stations. And if this is true, that's why we observe different political outcomes that are a result, of course, of voting stations technologies. However, the fact that I find evidence on surveys and on voting intentions seems to suggest that this channel is not prevalent. It might also be the case that 3G internet and the arrival of this technology makes investigative journalism better, so upgrade the quality of journalism, and this spillovers to traditional media. However, I do not find this evidence into using survey data. So that hypothesis doesn't seem to hold. And finally, the spread out of the internet might affect economic development and migration. And in this case, of course, these outcomes might eventually affect political outcomes. However, I don't find an direct impact of 3G on density, which is a result of migration. Okay, to conclude, the arrival of 3G internet, I find that the arrival of 3G internet in South Africa affected participation and competition at ballots and the distribution of vote shares. So between 2006 and 2016, turnout increased by 2 percentage points as a result of 3G coverage. And that's more or less 4% of its value in 2006. ANC vote share dropped by more or less 4.5% of its value in 2006. And finally, the number of parties increased by 10%. I find some suggested evidence that information and coordination played a role. On information, I find that reduced cost to access information on administration might exacerbate political discontent, and therefore voters punish the incumbent party. While on coordination, I find that perhaps lower communication costs between politicians or candidates and voters incentivize new party formation. And overall, I guess the main lesson is that this type of technologies in a developing country might actually have disruptive impact on the political landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dante, for this very clear and interesting presentation. I think you did lots of stuff there, and there are lots of interesting results. Maybe let me open the floor for any questions. I also have some questions, but let the others start first. Anybody would like to ask anything? You can just unmute yourself or raise hands. Because
Dante, sorry.
Is it Willem? Okay.
Yes, it's me.
Go ahead.
So my question is, thank you very much, Dante. I thought one question, I guess, is also not only what is the impact on voter turnout, but also how many municipalities flipped in terms of control. It's a stronger form of change. And I was wondering whether you thought about that. I mean, so you could have a shift of 1 or 2 ANC councillors this way or that way, but still the ANC may well retain control of most municipalities.
No, that's a probably super interesting to see. I didn't put time and effort to actually look for this, and that's thanks. I mean, that's a great point. Yeah, I don't have an answer for this, unfortunately, but yeah. Actually, I mean, by the way, I mean, since it's the first time I present to a South African audience, whatever comments you have, it's it's great. So like comment like this, it's helped me a lot in the revision of this paper.
There's a raised hand by Lucas.
Hey Dante, very nice presentation. I really enjoyed the paper. So my question is more about what's the kind of show some change in behavior of the voters. I was wondering about the politicians changing the behavior, because I don't know if this is the on this paper, maybe it's a spin-off of this paper, but the provision of public goods and also like the communication of the politicians itself. There is a recent paper by Ferraz and Campanci that they show that after the staggered adoption of 3G in Brazil, that the communication of congressmen changed, and actually they decreased the federal transfers to the municipalities that had more 3G. And in the end, what happens is that they are changing like the goods provision and the communication. So do you have any inputs about that? I know that this, maybe it's like another paper.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't. So that paper, I understand. I see what paper you're talking about. So yeah, that's more like the political accountability side, right? So the fact that thanks to changing, it's like posing a threat to politicians, right? And of course, this type of technology can affect politicians' behaviors. I don't have direct evidence on this for South Africa. I remember like Gavazza, they have some evidence on internet and expenditure for the UK. No, I only know that just for suggestive evidence that especially new parties have been quite good at using social media, like tweet, like the economic freedom fighters. I was reading some reports, and that might be just some some suggestive evidence that politicians react to the advent of these technologies, but not. I don't have like hard evidence on expenditure. Also because I don't have the data, so that's also one issue. Because the data on expenditure is very recent, and if I remember correctly, the municipal data on expenditure start from 2012. That was one issue. But thanks.
All right, there's still time for any other questions. If anybody would like to ask, please unmute yourself or raise the hand. If not, I also have a question. So obviously in South Africa, as well as in other African countries, there is an issue of smartphones penetration. And while you look at coverage, that doesn't go in line with how many people actually have smartphones. I think in 2000, like right now, this will be probably 60%. I mean, what for having 3G technology if you cannot really use it? So I know it will be difficult, if not impossible, at least on geographic level. I think it's impossible, but I think it's also one possible issue here.
So I guess mobile companies, they know that, right?
Yes, mobile companies, they know that.
They know that very well, I guess.
I'm mentioning this also because, in fact, I work on a paper that is about smartphone penetration, and I do have geographic distribution of how many people have smartphones. But obviously, there'll be more people in richer neighborhood than poorer neighborhood. I mean, coverage, as you suggest, also goes first to richer neighborhood, but still, yeah, I mean, this might be also a potential issue.
Yeah, so what I know about that, so it's not about smartphone. I know that so the penetration rate of phones, not smartphones, phones, broad category, they actually tend to be So they tended to increase after the arrival of 3G, with people probably having 2 phones. And that is, I guess, so I'm not sure if it's common to South Africa, but at least when I was in Nigeria, I remember that, you know, many people tend to have 2 phones, right? One is a dumb phone, no smartphone, and the other one is a smartphone. And the average number of phones per capita per person actually doubled between 2006 and 2016. So that might actually suggest that people are actually uptaking new phones, and those phones are smartphones. But of course, I mean, there is always the issue of who gets those phones, the richest ones, and of course that's open a new discussion on the digital divide.
With this respect, if I can say so, it is indeed a difficult question, especially spatial distribution of smartphones. So I do have some research with some colleagues on the impact of coverage on adoption of smartphones. I mean, I'm happy to share this with you.
Yeah, thanks.
But it's something very difficult to assess how coverage drives adoption of smartphones. Certainly very interesting for policymakers. Nevertheless, I guess just a comment.
Thanks. No, of course.
It's a good, I mean, coverage is good proxy, certainly, but I think the smartphone adoption lags behind a bit. So maybe that's something.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, that was my question. Is there anybody else who would like to ask any questions?
Dante, just maybe quickly again, me. So I probably just missed this, how you deal with the geographic differences and in using control variables. But I'm just thinking, if you control for, if you compare, let's say, KZN, KwaZulu-Natal with, let's say, Northwest or Limpopo, you might, I mean, these are all effectively big swaths of those provinces could be termed rural, but one would think in Natal, in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, ANC support, especially for Mr. Zuma, has been very, very strong. So you might find a different result there. So I'm just thinking about how you control for the geographic differences in terms of interacting then with the impact that the mobile coverage has.
Yeah. So yeah, no, thanks. That's a great point. So in general, I'm always controlling for like distance to cities as a proxy of urbanization, and also urbanization rates from the census data. But that's not an interaction, as you clearly pointed out. So what you says is that, so there might be 2 effects, right? So one is that in cities, ANC party, because of the internet, can lose more because the initial share of supporters was larger, right? And in fact, if so in terms of spatial variation of the impacts of the magnitudes, I do find that the impact on the ANC share is tend to be larger in closer to cities. That's true. That happens. I didn't show it, but I have that heterogeneity of the results. I also find another interesting evidence about the ethnicity. So if I remember correctly, Zuma belongs to the Zulu tribe, right? And I do find that results are basically seems to be driven by the behavior of the Zulu tribe. So while initially they tended to support the president, after the scandals, especially in 2016, the Zulu tribe basically, so the president, the ANC party lost approximately 16 percentage points because of the internet in that region. So that, you know, is still, I guess it's an interesting result.
Okay, we reached 3 o'clock. If there's any other urgent question, then it's the last moment to ask. Otherwise, you can always contact Dante, I guess, per email.
Yeah.
And
Sure, thanks.
well, thank you very much again for your presentation, as well as for all the attendance. And we'll keep you informed about next seminars. And to you, Dante, good luck with finalizing your research and publications.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.